Thank you. It is on the internet. I don't believe everything I read on the internet.
I don't know who's saying that.
All right. You're not going to be recording this many times soon. You know.
No. Not that I know.
All right. All right.
Okay, so picture this. It's 2013. Bon Jovi is in the middle of one of the biggest tours of their entire career. Tens of thousands of fans filling arenas every single night. The band is on fire, the money is flowing, everything looks perfect from the outside. And then, one of the most iconic guitarists in rock history just disappears. No press conference, no statement, no real explanation, just gone. And for over a decade, the world has been fed this vague, messy narrative, full of tabloid drama, addiction rumors, and whispers of some massive falling out between Richie Sambora and Jon Bon Jovi. But here's the thing, and this is what nobody is actually talking about. The real story is so much more human than any of that. It's not a rock and roll scandal. It's about a man who was quietly drowning and finally decided to save his own life. And today, we're going to get into all of it. The stuff the headlines missed, the stuff Richie himself didn't talk about for years. And honestly, by the end of this video, you might see this entire situation in a completely different light. Welcome to Hidden Fame Files. Let's get into it. All right, first, can we just appreciate for a second what Richie Sambora actually was to Bon Jovi? Because I feel like people who didn't grow up with this band sometimes forget how fundamental this guy was. He wasn't just the guitarist who stood to the right of John on stage. He was literally the co-architect of the entire Bon Jovi sound. Think about every song that made you feel something. Livin' on a Prayer, Wanted Dead or Alive, I'll Be There For You, Bad Medicine. Richie Sambora co-wrote nearly all of it. The riffs, the solos, the harmonies, that was him. John was the voice and the face, absolutely. But Richie was the soul of the music, the heartbeat behind the guitar. He joined the band in 1983, literally before they were anybody, and spent the next 30 years helping build one of the most successful rock acts in history. We're talking over 130 million records sold worldwide, stadium tours on every continent, a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction. 30 years. Think about how long that is. That's longer than most people stay in any job, any relationship, any city. For 3 decades, Richie Sambora showed up and poured himself into that band. So when he suddenly walked out mid-tour in April 2013, without a proper goodbye, without a real explanation, people were stunned, fans were devastated, and naturally, the rumor mill went absolutely haywire. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and I want you to stick with me on this because this is the part that completely changes the narrative. The tabloids immediately started doing what tabloids do. They zeroed in on Richie's history with addiction and rehab. They hinted at some explosive falling out with John. They painted this picture of a guy who had lost the plot. And that story, the messy, dramatic soap opera version, that's the one that stuck around for years. But let's back up, because the truth, it starts way before 2013. It starts with a series of personal losses that would absolutely break most people. Losses that Richie was somehow expected to just absorb and keep performing through like they were nothing. Here's the timeline that most people don't know. 1. His wife, actress Heather Locklear, one of the biggest TV stars of the 80s and 90s, files for divorce after 11 years of marriage. Now, any divorce is hard, but a high-profile divorce like this, with a daughter involved in the middle of a media frenzy, that's not just heartbreak. That's heartbreak on a public stage with cameras in your face. Then, while Richie is still processing that, the divorce gets finalized in April 2007, and literally weeks later, in that same month, his father, Adam, dies of lung cancer. Let that sink in for a second. Divorce finalized, father dead. Same month. And what was Richie Sambora supposed to do? He was a member of Bon Jovi. The machine didn't stop. The tour was already booked. The album cycle was already in motion. You don't just tell 50,000 people their concert is canceled because you need to sit with your grief for a while. The show must go on, right? And so Richie did what a lot of people in his position do. He pushed it all down. He kept going. And the emotional weight of everything he was carrying started expressing itself in the only ways pain knows how to. He went through rehab twice. He was open about struggling with alcohol dependency. The tabloids had a field day. But here's the question I want you to ask yourself, and drop your answer in the comments below. If you were going through all of that, all at once, while also being expected to perform at the highest level every single night, how long do you think you could keep it together? Because I think most of us would have broken a lot sooner than Richie Sambora did. Now fast forward to around 2012, 2013. Bon Jovi is preparing for their Because We Can tour, a massive global run to support their 12th studio album, What About Now? And on the surface, everything looks like business as usual. But behind closed doors, there are cracks forming that nobody is talking about publicly. Richie is missing studio sessions. His personal struggles are bleeding into his professional life. And here's a detail that really tells you something about where his head was at. There was a specific moment during the recording of the album where Richie was excluded from playing guitar on a track called The Fighter. And that might sound like a small thing, but when you've been the musical backbone of a band for 30 years, being left off a song, even one song, sends a message. Keyboard player David Bryan described there being tension in the studio, and you could feel it. The creative partnership between Jon and Richie, the thing that had produced some of the biggest rock anthems of all time, was visibly fraying. And Richie himself, years later, put it in pretty stark terms. He said the band had started to feel like a Jon-centric machine. That's not him being bitter, by the way. That's him being honest about what the dynamic had become after 30 years. Bands evolve, power structures shift, and sometimes the person who's been carrying enormous personal pain doesn't have the emotional bandwidth to fight for their seat at the table anymore. So when the Because We Can tour kicked off in early 2013, Richie was already running on empty. And then, in April of that year, mid-tour, in the middle of a stretch of dates, he was just gone. At the time, the official statement was personal reasons. That's it. 2 words for one of the most dramatic exits in rock history. And here's where I want to pause for a second, because if you've been following this story, you know that there's been a lot of speculation ever since. Some people assumed it was purely about addiction, that he'd relapsed or wasn't well enough to perform. Others assumed there was a massive blow-up with Jon Bon Jovi. Others thought it was about money. And for years, Richie basically stayed quiet. He didn't go on a media tour to defend himself. He didn't air grievances in interviews. He just stepped back. And honestly, I think that silence was its own kind of answer. A man who was purely motivated by ego or resentment would have talked. He would have gone on every radio show and told his side of the story. But Richie didn't, because the truth was more private than any of the rumors. By the way, if you're finding this interesting and you're not already subscribed to Hidden Fame Files, now's actually the perfect moment. Hit that subscribe button, because this is the kind of deep dive storytelling we do here every single week. And while you're at it, if this video is opening your eyes to a side of this story you hadn't heard before, smash that like button. It genuinely helps us keep making content like this. Okay, back to Richie. So what actually happened after he left? Well, first, Jon Bon Jovi brought in Canadian guitarist Phil X as a temporary replacement. And Phil did the job. He kept the tour going, he learned the catalog, he was professional about it. But the understanding, at least in Jon's mind, was always that this was temporary, that Richie would come back. Except he didn't. Months passed, then a year, then another year. And in 2016, Phil X was officially named a permanent member of the band. And it was around this time that Richie started opening up a little more publicly about why he'd left. In 2016, he told reporters, "I really needed to take some time to be with my daughter. She needed me, and I needed her, actually." And that, right there, is the heart of the whole thing. Because here's what people forget when they're talking about rock stars. These are actual human beings with actual families, and Richie's daughter Ava was entering her teenage years. Her parents were divorced. Her mother, Heather Locklear, was going through some very public mental health struggles of her own at this time, and Ava needed a stable, present parent. Richie chose to be that parent. He chose his daughter over the stadium tours. He chose bedtime conversations and school pickups over guitar solos in front of 80,000 people. And look, I'm not saying that was easy. I'm not saying he didn't mourn the career and the brotherhood he was stepping away from, but he made a choice, a human choice, a dad choice. And there's something really worth respecting in that, isn't there? Now, here's something that happened in 2020 that kind of added another layer to all of this, and this is where you can really see the depth of what Richie was going through. In an interview with People magazine, Sambora said something that really stood out. He talked about not wanting to miss his daughter's life. He said, and I'm quoting, that you can't just be on the road all the time and be a good dad. And he talked about having a lot of conscious work to do, acknowledging his own struggles with substance abuse and the emotional weight of being a single parent trying to hold it together. That's not the statement of someone who stormed off in a fit of rage. That's the statement of someone who looked at his life and said, something has to change, or I'm not going to be okay. And that something turned out to be one of the most successful rock bands in the history of music. That's not a small thing to walk away from. That is an enormous act of courage, dressed up in a decision that looked, from the outside, like chaos. Now, quick question for you in the comments, and I'm genuinely curious about this one. Do you think more celebrities should walk away from things that are destroying them, even if it means letting fans down? Or do you think when you're a public figure at that level, you owe it to people to push through? There's no right answer here. I just want to know what you think. Okay, so now we get to the part that really lit the internet on fire. Because in 2024, after years of relative quiet from Richie, everything kind of came to a head. Hulu released a 4-part documentary series called Thank You, Good Night, the Bon Jovi story, and it was a big deal. It had unprecedented access. It covered the full arc of the band's career, the highs and the lows, the relationships and the rifts. And Richie Sambora was in it. Now, before the documentary came out, Richie had reportedly watched portions of it with Jon at Jon's house, so there was at least some level of communication happening. But what Richie said in the documentary, and how the documentary framed his departure, clearly affected him deeply. In episode 4, Sitting on Camera, Richie said something that I think a lot of people didn't expect. He said, "I don't regret leaving the situation, but I regret how I did it. So I want to apologize fully right now, to the fans especially, and also to the guys." That's a very specific, very considered statement. Notice what he's not saying. He's not saying, "I regret leaving." He's not saying, "I made a mistake." He's saying, "I needed to go, but I didn't handle the exit with the grace and communication that the people around me deserved, and for that, I'm sorry." That's the difference between someone who ran away and someone who survived. And by the way, if this video is hitting different for you right now, if you're feeling like this is the real story behind the headlines, this is actually the perfect moment to hit the hype button. If you're watching on YouTube and you see that hype feature, tap it. It's a newer way to show support for videos and creators you believe in, and it genuinely helps channels like Hidden Fame Files reach more people who'd appreciate this kind of storytelling. All right, back to what happened next. Because here's where it gets a little complicated, and I want to be fair to both sides here. Jon Bon Jovi, in his own interviews about the documentary, said he wasn't surprised by Richie's apology, but he was also pretty clear about how the whole thing had affected him personally. He said, "My heartbreak with him is the way he walked out on us, compounded by the fact that it took him years to come back in the room just to have a meal with Tico and David and I and say, 'I'm sorry.'" And you know what? That's also a valid thing to feel. Jon built something extraordinary with Richie. They were creative partners for 30 years. They were brothers in the truest sense of the word. And when Richie left the way he did, no conversation, no warning, mid-tour, that hurt. That was a betrayal of trust, even if the reasons behind it were completely understandable. But here's what I think is the most important thing to hold in your mind when you're looking at this situation. Two things can be true at the same time. Richie can have had legitimate, serious, life-or-death reasons for leaving, and Jon can have been genuinely hurt by how it happened. Both of those things are real. Neither one cancels the other out. And honestly, that's what makes this story so much more interesting than the tabloid version. Because the tabloid version needed a villain, and the truth is, there isn't one. There's just two incredibly successful men who loved making music together, who had a complicated human relationship, and who handled a crisis in ways that were messy and imperfect, because that's what humans do. Now, one thing I haven't talked about yet, and I think this matters, is the physical toll of what it actually means to be in a band like Bon Jovi. We see the glamour, we see the arenas, we see the private jets and the screaming crowds and the pyrotechnics. What we don't see is what happens to a human body after 30 years of that. Night after night after night, different city every morning, sleep deprivation, jet lag, the physical demands of performing at full intensity. Richie's guitar rig alone weighed hundreds of pounds. The pressure to be on every single time, no matter how you're feeling, no matter what's happening in your personal life. And Richie Sambora was dealing with all of that while also being a newly divorced single dad, while grieving his father, while fighting his own battles with substance abuse, while feeling increasingly creatively sidelined in the band he'd helped build. And the thing that really strikes me, the thing that no one seemed to be asking at the time, is who was asking Richie Sambora if he was okay? Because from everything we know now, the answer seems to be not enough people, not loudly enough, not early enough. The machine kept moving, the tour kept being booked, the album kept being recorded, and Richie kept being expected to show up and deliver at a world-class level, regardless of what was happening inside him. And eventually, the body and the spirit simply said enough. So here's where things stand today. As of 2025, Richie Sambora is not rejoining Bon Jovi. He won't be part of the 2026 Forever Tour, the band's massive farewell run. And while there have been reports of tensions still lingering, Jon Bon Jovi has publicly maintained that the love between them is real, even if the working relationship isn't. Jon said in a 2024 interview that there's always love there, even if they're on different paths now. And Richie, for his part, has leaned into his solo work, his collaborations with guitarist Orianthi in their duo RSO, and, most importantly, his life as a dad. Ava Sambora is now in her mid-20s, and by all accounts, she and her father have a close, genuine relationship, which is exactly what Richie said he was choosing when he walked away from one of the biggest bands in the world. Was it worth it? I mean, you'd have to ask him. But every indication is that Richie Sambora has found a kind of peace that he wasn't going to find on another stadium tour. And there's something genuinely moving about that. Now here's the bigger thing I want to leave you with, because I think this story is about something that goes way beyond rock and roll. We live in a culture that absolutely worships the grind, the hustle, the push through it no matter what mentality. Especially for people who've achieved success at a high level, there's this unspoken expectation that you owe your continuing presence to the machine you helped build, that your personal struggles should be secondary to the performance, that grief is something you do on your own time. Richie Sambora said no to all of that, and it cost him. It cost him the band. It cost him the friendship, at least temporarily. It cost him a decade of being mischaracterized in the press. People called him unstable. They called his judgment into question. They wrote him off. But what he got in return was his daughter, his peace of mind, his health, his life, essentially. Because the path he was on, the one where you keep running the machine at any personal cost, rarely ends well for people in that much pain. So yeah, Richie Sambora left Bon Jovi. He left in a way that was messy and imperfect and hurt people who cared about him. And he owns that. He apologized for it. But the reason he left, the actual human reason, was survival. It was love for his kid. It was the decision to finally put himself first. And I don't know about you, but I think that's a story worth telling. All right, one final question before I go, and I really want your take on this one in the comments. Looking at everything we've covered today, do you think Richie Sambora made the right call? Could he have handled it differently and still protected his mental health and his relationship with his daughter? Or was walking away, the way he did, the only real option he had left? I read every single comment, so let me know what you think. This community always has the most thoughtful perspectives, and this is exactly the kind of topic where I want to hear from you. If you want more deep dives like this one, the real stories behind the famous names, the stuff that gets buried under the headlines, then you're in the right place. Hidden Fame Files is where we peel back the curtain on fame, legacy, and the very human cost of both. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the like button if this video gave you something to think about. And I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and remember, success means nothing if you're not around to enjoy it.